Israel Keyes is the most terrifying serial killer you've quite possibly never even heard of. Israel was not only a serial killer, but he was also a serial rapist, serial arsonist, bank robber, and abductor. He was active in several of the U.S. states, including Alaska. He was a killer who planned murders ahead of time and took extraordinary action to avoid detection. Unlike most serial killers, he did not have a victim profile since he preferred to choose a victim randomly. He usually killed far from home and never in the same area twice. On his murder trips, he kept his cell phone turned off and paid for everything with cash. He had absolutely no connection to any of his known victims. For one set of murders I will be telling you about later on, Israel Keyes flew to Chicago where he rented a car and then drove 1,000 miles to Vermont. From there, he dug up the kill kit he had hidden in the area 2 years earlier in order to perform these murders. It wasn't until Israel made the mistake of killing close to home that he was finally apprehended. This led to FBI interviews with one of the most cunning, malicious killers in United States history. Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're having a fantastic day, evening, weekend, weekday. Whenever you're listening to this podcast, we are talking about Israel Keyes in this episode. And I'm thinking it's probably going to be 2 episodes. I'm not really quite sure, but all I do know is I have a lot of notes here on my iPad, and I'm kind of thinking I'm not going to be able to cram it all in to 1 episode. So be prepared. There were many different podcasts that I've listened to in the last couple years that have also covered Israel Keyes, and a lot of them are disappointing because they'll have like 1 episode that's 30, 40, or 45 minutes long. And like, now that I'm doing the research, guys, I've been doing research on Israel for at least 2 weeks, seriously. I've toyed around with doing this case for the last couple of months, and I just didn't really have it in me at the time to be able to do the research that was necessary because there's so much to this case. So do not be surprised if at the end of this episode I say, hey, there's an episode 2 that's coming out soon, because that could quite possibly be what's going to happen. But honestly, Israel Keyes is the serial killer that scares me the most, but he's also the serial killer that intrigues me the most. And like, when I was putting together my notes, I'm going to be starting with talk about Israel. And I noticed that a lot of the other podcasts, almost all of them, start with talk about victims of his, like known victims. And I decided just to give y'all the background of Israel Keyes' childhood and everything he did while growing up in the beginning. So I'm going to kind of shift things around from what you might normally hear. He's fucking scary, guys. He's fucking scary. Like when you hear this, if you've never heard about him before, just the way he was so meticulous and malicious, and just all the planning that he does ahead of time, like, it's super freaky. And I don't know of another serial killer in history that has planned things so well. And I don't want to give him props for that, but at the same time, I need to give him props for that, because it makes him that much more scary. And the thought of there possibly being like copycat Israel Keys out there, it weirds the fuck out of me. I've lost a lot of sleep in the past 2 weeks, diving into my deep research, and I'll be happy when this case, like the recordings, are behind me. I'm not super sure how quickly I'm going to be able to forget him or stop thinking about him and his victims, because this is just a truly horrifying scenario, what I'm going to be talking about. So I need you guys to know, trigger warnings, abduction, murder, possibly necrophilia, not sure, just all the things, okay? So be prepared. So if, there's going to be a trigger warning for animal abuse as well. I'll let you know when that part is coming so you can skip it. I'm a huge animal lover, and like, honestly, I don't know why, but I can hear about people being murdered all day long. But if I hear details about an animal, it breaks my heart. I don't know why I'm like that. Maybe you're like that too. I mean, I do care about people as well, but sometimes I just can't handle, hearing the animal stuff. So I'll make sure to like give you that trigger warning right before I talk about that. But just know that there's a lot of gruesome things on here, so this may not be a case that you want to listen to. And if it's something that's not up your alley, that's cool. I will hit you up with another episode, something maybe a little bit tamer after I'm done with Israel Keys. But for now, let's dig into this one, shall we? So Israel Keys was born in Richmond, Utah on January 7th of 1978 to parents Heidi and John Jeffrey Keys. He was the second oldest of 10 children, as well as the oldest son. His family were fundamentalist Mormons at the time of his birth, and they had ties to the fundamentalist Mormon leader, Warren Jeffs. Israel and all of his siblings were homeschooled, and they were taught Mormon beliefs until 1983. After that, though, the family left the Mormon faith, and Israel's father moved the family to a very large acreage of land that was located north of Colville, Washington. Israel was only 5 years old at this time. The family seemed to follow an almost Amish lifestyle, and they were completely isolated from society. The Keys family lived in a one-room cabin located at Rocky Creek Road, and it was completely built by Israel's father. They lived in poverty without electricity or even running water. Some of the older kids had to sleep in tents during the warmer months of the year because, oh my gosh, like, can y'all even imagine 12 fucking people all trying to sleep in one little tiny cabin, like a one room cabin? I cannot. But anyway, all of the kids held jobs to earn money, but they were all the kind of under the table types of jobs, like working on farms or cutting firewood. The family attended services at another church at this time, and that church was called the Ark. This is a quote-unquote church that practiced white supremacist Christian identity ideology. So, basically, they were racist fucks. Israel and all of his siblings were incredibly isolated. They didn't have birth certificates, social security numbers. They never went to a doctor, and none of them ever had any vaccinations. It's interesting to note that the Keyes family became close friends with their neighbors during this time. A family by the name of Kehoe. One of the Kehoe sons would later go on a killing rampage in the name of their Aryan Republican Army in 1996. It was at this time that he killed a family of 3 in Arkansas. I'll probably cover that case sometime in the future. But in the meantime, I just want to say that I find it really strange. Like, sons from 2 different households in the same exact isolated area both grew up to be murderers. While growing up, Israel was obsessed with guns. He said he would shoot at houses with BB guns and break into homes if nobody came out to scold him. He also started fires out in the woods. So obviously these are both some pretty big red flags. Destructive tendencies without any regard or respect for others' property is a pretty good indication that there will be more trouble down the line. Israel stood at 6 foot 2 inches by the time he was 14 years old, and this is around the age that his psychopathy began to emerge. He continued breaking into nearby homes and was also stealing guns. He would hide the stolen guns in a secret spot in his house, and on occasion, he would even sell the stolen guns to local adults. His parents did eventually find his stash because, it's a 1-room cabin. There can't be many hiding places for real. Anyways, they made Israel return the guns to their proper owners and apologize to them, and no charges were ever filed. As a hobby, Israel hunted, quote unquote, anything with a heartbeat, and freely admitted to skinning a deer alive in front of his peers at the church. As a result, Israel was ostracized and actively avoided by various youths who all attended that same church. There was one girl who recounted that Israel's presence made her skin crawl. There was also an incident with his sister's cat, and this is the trigger warning that I was, talking about a couple of minutes ago. Trigger warning, big time for animal abuse. If you don't want to hear this part of the story, I would suggest that you skip ahead a minute or maybe even a little bit more. Here we go, guys.
I've known since I was 14 that there were things that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else seems to think are normal and okay. Yeah. When I was 14, there were some friends staying with us, and there was a cat of ours that was always getting into the trash, and it was my sister's cat, and I told her at the time, I was like, if that cat gets into the trash again, I'm going to kill it. And so there was this kid and some of his, I think maybe one of my sisters and one of his sisters. We all went up into the woods, and I had the cat with me. And took a piece of parachute cord and tied it to this tree. The parachute cord was about 10 feet long, and I had a .22 revolver with me, and I shot it in the stomach, and it ran around and around the tree, and then crashed into the tree, and then started vomiting. And as soon as that, for me, I didn't really react. I mean, I actually kind of laughed a little, I think, because of the way it was running around the tree. But then I looked over at everybody else, and the kid who was about my age was with me. He was throwing up, like he was like really, I don't know, traumatized, I guess you would say. And he told his dad about it, and then of course his dad talked to my parents about it, and that was pretty much the last time anybody went in the woods with me.
Oh gosh, I cannot stand his voice. I cannot stand his laugh. He's a fucking monster. And yeah, so let's move on from that. During his teenage years, Israel had become a skilled and proficient carpenter, building his first wooden cabin at age 16. He also began working for a Colville contractor from 1995 until 1997. Around this time, Israel kept a journal from early childhood, which was littered with Bible scriptures. It documented his daily sins for which he felt shame, such as lusting after his girlfriend Annie, who was the daughter of his boss at the time. Israel's parents forbade their relationship, though, and it wasn't long before his family relocated again. This time, the family moved to Smyrna, Maine, and they became involved in the maple syrup business, of all things, which is weird. But anyways, they were into maple syrup. In case you haven't already figured this out, Heidi fucking Keyes changed her religious beliefs as often as typical people change their fucking underwear. And due to her religious zealousness, the Keyes' children were forced to secretly flee their parents' presence in order for them just to be normal fucking people. So if they wanted to watch movies with friends, for instance, and they were also forbidden to learn how to play any musical instruments, because apparently Heidi Keyes believed that they were instruments, quote unquote, against God. It was during this period of time that Israel publicly renounced his former Christian faith. Now, when Israel completely abandoned his faith, it of course caused a huge rift between him and his parents. Israel became interested in Satanism, and that caused his family, mostly his father, to disown him. But I did hear that his mother had difficulty in cutting ties with her son. Israel's younger siblings, though, they were all instructed to never have contact with Israel again, although they had always looked up to him. Soon after this, Israel began planning a satanic ritual involving a young woman. And fuck, this gives me total fucking chills. Like, not like the quote unquote full body chills like some people say. But it gives me like the heebie-jeebies, let's just say that. It's reminiscent of the Elise Poller case that I literally just fucking covered in episode 27. If you didn't listen to that case, you need to go back and you need to listen to it, because it's very insane and crazy and upsetting and all those things. And it's just, ugh. Anyways, Israel planned the entire thing in his head without telling anyone about it. He began staking out places and people, just waiting for his prey to present itself to him. One day, during the summer of 1997, he stood on the beach along the Deschutes River, near a place that was popular for float trips. As he watched a big group of tubers float by, Israel noticed that one girl was a little bit left behind and was the last tuber in her group. This bold-ass motherfucker walked out into the water, grabbed a hold of the girl, dragged her to a remote campground bathroom, and tied her up with ropes before raping her. His plan was to strangle her, but the girl, who he believed to be somewhere between the ages of 14 and 18, kept talking to him. She was terrified and kept telling him that she wouldn't tell anybody if he just let her go. She was pretty smart because it worked. Things never got really violent like they could have if she had been fighting back. Israel was pretty timid at this time, and he wasn't at his most violent point yet. Incredibly, he did let this girl go. This girl never reported the incident, so no charges were ever filed. We don't even know who this victim was to this day because she's never come forward. By the way, it's also been reported that in 1996, Julie Harris, a 12-year-old Special Olympics medalist in skiing, disappeared. Her remains were found a year later in a wooded area just a few miles away, including her prosthetics. Cassie Emerson, another young girl from the Colville area, was reported missing after her mother's remains were discovered in their burned-out trailer home in June of 1997. Cassie's remains were found a year later, about 13 miles from her home. There were no arrests in either of these cases, but one would have to assume that Israel could potentially and quite possibly be a suspect in both of those disappearances and murders. In July of 1998, Israel enlisted in the United States Army. After boot camp, he passed a rigorous month-long preliminary course for the United States Army Rangers training. He was stationed for about 6 months in Egypt, and many recalled that he had taken trips to Tel Aviv with his army friends to find sex workers. Israel later told the FBI that during his time in the army, he realized that he didn't really believe in Satan. He was really just pissed off during his teenage years. He was angry about his religious upbringing, and he just used Satanism as an excuse. He said that this is when he was in the army, is when he began to use common sense. At this time of his life, he considered himself to be an atheist, so he figured he obviously could not be a Satanist. Former army friends of Israel's noted his quiet demeanor and his habit of keeping to himself. On weekends, he was reported to drink heavily, consuming entire bottles of his favorite drink, yucky, wild turkey bourbon. If you're a fan, I'm sorry, but yuck. Yuck to the yuck. I do not like bourbon. Can you tell? Anyways, he was also a fan of the hip-hop duo Insane Clown Posse and displayed posters of the musical act in the barracks, which when I read this in my research, I was totally fucking laughing my ass off because Israel Keys as a fucking juggalo, it just fucking almost made me hysterically laugh. I'm not even joking. But my younger brother, this is why I think it's funny. My younger brother, I was 14 when he was born. I remember he used to fucking love ICP. And I remember he talked my mom into bringing him and one of his girlfriends to some bullshit music festival that they had out in the woods. And it's just too funny. Oh my gosh. But anyways, in February of 2001, Israel was arrested for drunk driving. And in a plea agreement, he was fined $350, and he did have his driver's license suspended at that time. Israel was also stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington, and it's here that he met a woman named Tammy. They connected on the dating site Match.com. And little side note, Israel was fucking engaged to another woman when he was on this said dating app trying to meet other women. Like, why do people do this? My ex-fiance did this shit to me all the time too. And I would say that dudes who do that are a piece of shit, but that would be an insult to pieces of shit. Anyways, Tammy had an 8-year-old son named James, and it's truly such a small world because James's father, Joe, was also in the army, and he was stationed at the same military base as Israel was. Joe thought that out of all the relationships that Tammy had had after they broke up, he liked Israel the most. Just 8 weeks into their relationship, Tammy became pregnant with Israel's baby, and she wanted to keep that baby. Israel was not at all happy about the pregnancy at first. And although the couple broke up for a short period of time, they ended up getting back together. Israel was awarded an Army Achievement Medal for his service as a gunner and assistant gunner, and at 23 years of age, he was honorably discharged. He relocated to Nia Bay, Washington with Tammy. Their daughter, we'll call her Sarah, was born on Halloween in 2001, and everyone who knew Israel during this time thought that he was a good man and an even better father. Due to the fact that Tammy was half black and half Native American, the couple was able to move onto the Makah Reservation in Nia Bay. Israel worked for the tribal authority in the Parks and Recreation Department. A co-worker of his later came forward and said that Israel was a motivated and meticulous worker. He was also a motivated and meticulous killer, wasn't he? But anyways, this coworker also characterized Israel as a kind and responsible father. Apparently, Israel would go to work and just brag about his daughter incessantly. Though he appeared to be a caring family man, Israel was skilled at living a double life, and he later hinted to investigators that he actually committed his first murder soon after moving to the reservation because, you know, quote unquote, Nia Bay is a boring town. Over the next 6 years, Israel killed 4 more people in Washington, but he refused to give investigators any identifying details at all. I'll do a deep dive into who these victims may have been later on. In the spring after Sarah's birth, Tammy and Israel got engaged. Tammy has stated that Israel was never violent to her, and he was never even jealous, almost to the point where she thought like he was way too mellow, too agreeable, too honest, and she later admitted to sometimes trying to push his buttons. In my research, it seems like Tammy was the one that became jealous in the relationship. I think that maybe her intuition was trying to tell her something. She began trying to get into Israel's computer and also his gaming system whenever he wasn't around. She was determined to find out if he was cheating on her because something just didn't seem right. She would have never, ever been able to guess that her fiancé was actually a murderer. Although Israel was a great father, she never knew what he did or where he went off to sometimes. He was always super secretive about his me time, and it just didn't sit well with her. When Sarah was just a toddler, Tammy was diagnosed with uterine cancer, and Israel stepped up to the plate and totally took care of Sarah while Tammy fought to get well. Israel totally doted on his little girl, even learning how to braid her hair. Tammy eventually became addicted to painkillers, and the couple ended up splitting up in May of 2004. About a year or so later, Israel began a relationship with a new woman named Kimberly Anderson. She was reportedly 9 or 10 years older than he was. She was a nurse practitioner and fiercely independent. I think he probably chose Kimberly because she was willing and able to fund a lot of his out-of-town adventures without asking a lot of questions. In 2007, Israel moved to Anchorage, Alaska with Kimberly, and Sarah went with them. There, he started a construction business called Keys Construction. He worked as a handyman, contractor, and construction worker. Israel and Kimberly were a seemingly normal couple. They enjoyed things like hiking, fishing, hunting, kayaking, and camping. So pretty much the usual types of activities one would be interested in if they lived in Alaska. But Israel's urges to kill and destroy were brewing, and he started making plans, as well as some rules for himself. He decided that, first of all, he would not commit crimes too close to home, and that he would always make sure that his victims had nothing in common. They'd be different ages and chosen completely at random. He specifically went for campgrounds and isolated locations. He later claimed to have used guns only when he had to, and he preferred strangulation. He derived pleasure from witnessing victims lose consciousness during the struggle. He also later claimed that he did not kill children or parents of children, primarily because of his daughter. He deeply feared Sarah ever finding out about his crimes. However, police and FBI investigators were later a bit skeptical, and they did suspect Israel of killing several teens and children during his reign of terror. One of the most chilling aspects of Israel's method of operation is the complete lack of any motive other than pleasure. He wasn't compelled by some uncontrollable force, but it was something that he could control, and he just loved to kill. The creepiest and most cunning thing of all, I think, is that Israel would travel often, and during his travels, he would rob a bank somewhere, and then he would stash kill kits near future crime scenes. These kill kits, contained cash, weapons, and supplies to dispose of his victims' bodies, including duct tape, shovels, guns, rope, Drano, and lye. Unlike most serial killers, Israel was methodical. And I don't know if you guys heard Juliet, my puppy, one of my puppies, but she just made this loud groaning sound, and it kind of threw me off for a second. So if you heard something weird, that was not my tummy growling. That was my little puppy dog being a drama queen because I told her she had to be quiet. But anyways, Israel was methodical, and he would later travel thousands of miles back to where he buried a kill kit. And that is when he would randomly come across his victims. He told authorities that he would leave his home in Anchorage, Alaska, under the guise of visiting distant friends and family members, and no one would have or could have ever suspected that he was actually going on a multi-state killing spree. At the time of his eventual arrest, Israel said that he had multiple kill kits buried all across the United States. Fucking scarier than hell. So, like right now, guys, there are kill kits buried that he left there. there's kill kits, and some have been found since. A couple of them have been found. I'm going to post a picture of one that was found in New York. I have a couple pictures. I have a picture of it when it was still like in the ground, and then I have a picture of the items that were inside. It's just like a Home Depot bucket filled with all his shit, and it's so fucking scary. It's like the thing that nightmares are made of. Like, he was so methodical. Oh, here they go, puppies barking. Fun. Now, speaking of puppy dogs barking, one of Israel Keys's other rules was that he never went after anybody with a dog. For obvious reasons. You just heard, like, I don't even know, there was the smallest noise outside, and Junie came running out of my bedroom barking. So, yeah, Israel did not want any part of trying to, find any victims that had dogs. So, obviously, the dogs are going to alert the owners that he is there trying to abduct and murder them. So, anyways, good job, Junie. All right, guys. Now, prior to February 1st of 2012, Israel had selected the Common Grounds coffee stand located on Tudor Road for the site of his next abduction. He did this after considering a few other local coffee stands, but he chose Common Grounds because of its location and because it was open later than the other coffee stands. Common Grounds is basically one of those little tiny kiosk coffee shops that has a walk-up window as well as a drive-through. And I personally love those places. We have a couple of them around Pensacola too, and there's one not very far away from where I work. I don't go there very often, but it's really cute. It's just like this little tiny building. Anyway, Israel had never met and had never seen Samantha Koenig before this. But he approached the coffee stand just prior to closing time wearing a ski mask, and he ordered an Americano. Keep in mind that while it seems like someone wearing a ski mask would be a red flag, this was Alaska, so people obviously wore them all the time. Samantha, the barista, was, kind of like probably thinking, what the fuck, you're like showing up right before I'm about to close, but she made the coffee and she handed it to Israel, but then he pulled out a gun and demanded money. There is a video of this taken from the actual surveillance video, and it's up on YouTube. I'll be sure to link it in the case sources. You can 5,000% see Samantha's entire body language change at this point in the video. Samantha began emptying out the cash register for him. He then told her to turn off the lights, and when she did, Israel forced himself inside the coffee stand and tied Samantha's hands with zip ties. Like, on the video, guys, it's the creepiest fucking thing. Seeing him, like, crawl through the window, and he crawls through pretty fast for a man of, like, his size. If he's 6'2", like, he got in there so fucking quickly. It's literally the things that nightmares are made of. Israel asked where her car was, and she told him that she did not have a vehicle with her that night. She and her boyfriend Dwayne shared a truck, and she was actually going to be getting picked up by him when her shift was over. Israel was totally not counting on her not having her own vehicle, but he forcibly walked Samantha out of the coffee stand and towards Tudor Road. Samantha did manage to break away from Israel at one point, and she tried to make a run for it, but he chased her and he tackled her to the ground. He put one arm around her and he pointed a gun at her body with the other hand, telling her that she needed to cooperate, that the gun had very quiet ammo, and that she should not do anything to make him kill her. They walked across Tudor Road into the parking lot between the IHOP restaurant and the Dairy Queen, where Israel's white pickup truck was parked. Israel had previously prepared the truck for this abduction. He took the mounted toolboxes off the bed of his truck as well as removing his license plates. Israel then bound Samantha in the front passenger seat of the truck and drove away. Israel drove around town explaining to Samantha that this was a kidnapping for ransom, which was a bold-faced fucking lie. Samantha told Israel that her family did not have much money and that he was not likely going to get much in a ransom. But Israel explained to her that they would raise money for the ransom by seeking the public's help. Israel convinced Samantha that if she just cooperated, she would be returned to her family unharmed. Samantha believed him, and she actually tried to talk to him in an effort to convince him to just release her. At some point during this drive, Israel realized that Samantha did not have her cell phone with her, which was necessary for his plan to demand ransom money. He was planning to send a text message from Samantha's phone. So he turned around and drove back to Common Grounds, which is crazy, and re-entered the coffee stand, leaving Samantha bound inside his truck. He retrieved the cell phone, got back into the truck, and drove away. And this is fucking crazy to me because just think if he had done this at the time that Samantha's boyfriend, Dwayne, was there, like, expecting to pick Samantha up from work. You know what I mean? Like, if the timing had been perfect, everything would have been different. Everything. Israel then drove to another part of town where he sent 2 text messages from Samantha's phone. The first message was to Samantha's boyfriend, Dwayne, and the second one was to the owner of Common Grounds. The text messages made it appear that Samantha just had a really bad day and was leaving town for the weekend. Israel then took the battery out of Samantha's phone and asked Samantha for her debit card. Samantha explained to him that she shared a bank account with Dwayne and that her ATM card was in the truck that they also shared. Samantha told Israel where her house was located and gave him the PIN number to her ATM card. Israel first brought Samantha to his address. I was like looking at my notes and all of a sudden my mind went blank. I never claimed to be perfect. Just awesome. Anyways, Israel brought Samantha to his address first. He put her into the shed that was right next to his house. He bound her, and then he turned the radio up so loudly in the fucking shed that no one would hear her if she screamed. Let's keep in mind that Kimberly and Israel's daughter were both home at this time. It's so fucking crazy. It's crazy. Israel also told Samantha that he had a police scanner and would know if she attempted to alert the neighbors. Israel then drove to Samantha's house and retrieved the ATM card from her truck. While he was at Samantha's, he was confronted by her boyfriend, Dwayne, who had heard noises. He had come outside to check it out and yelled at him. The 2 men literally locked eyes before Dwayne went back into the house to get help. But then Israel ran back to his truck and left the area before he could be found. Israel drove to an ATM machine to test the PIN number provided by Samantha because he wanted to make sure that it worked, and it did, so he returned home. After checking in to make sure that both Sarah and Kimberly were both asleep, he poured himself a glass of bourbon, and he also poured Samantha a glass of red wine. He returned to the shed, let Samantha enjoy her glass of wine before raping her for hours. When he was finished raping her, he asphyxiated her, wrapped her body in a tarp, and then he stuffed her into a cupboard. And then he literally left Samantha's body there inside the shed so he could go back into his house. He was going to pack because he was going on this pre-planned cruise with his family and would be flying to New Orleans the very next morning. Israel woke his family up only an hour or two after raping Samantha, raping and killing her. And they all left for the airport early that morning to begin their vacation. Oh, hang on a second, guys. Like, my heart is just hurting right now. Okay. Yeah, this is brutal. Now, it's been reported that Israel performed acts of necrophilia with Samantha's body, but it's never been substantiated for sure. Apparently, he has alluded to this fact when he was later interviewed by the FBI, but that part of the FBI records have not ever been released to the public. So while I honestly feel that it's probable, and I will tell you why I think that in a moment, it just bothers me when I hear other podcasts and documentaries talk about Israel performing necrophilia like it's indeed a 100% fucking fact. We have to remember, guys, that there are surviving family members out there that are still hurting and struggling with the loss of their loved ones. It's only going to be exacerbated by false statements made by true crime podcasters and enthusiasts and the true crime community as a whole. But the reason why I think there is a real possibility that he did perform necrophilia at one point is this.
So I guess I identify most, or my favorite, if you have to put it that way, would be the ones that I identify most with.
Yeah,
so,
that's a fair way to say it.
I don't know, maybe just going off of what I've read, Ted Bundy maybe. I don't know. Just because I don't have a lot of respect for some of them because of the way they lived, I guess.
Sure.
I don't know. It's weird. I like reading about all of them, but
yeah,
that's what I identify about.
When did you start reading about them? When did you realize? I mean, did you start reading about them because you were curious about you, or was it a study guide, so to speak? I mean, that'd be a weird question too. Did you learn things from to do, not do, or was it just curiosity of do you have anything in common with them? Is that you were looking for? Do you think?
Well, the first book I read was. I think it was called Mind Hunter, and it was written by an FBI profiler.
John Douglas, right?
Yeah. I read that years and years ago, probably when I was 15 or 16 maybe. And I was, somewhat disturbed by it just because I don't know, it's always been that way. It's always felt like I was kind of reading about myself in a lot of those books.
Well, some interesting names.
Oh my gosh, just hearing his voice is just so chilling. And it honestly haunts me. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but like, these are the actual FBI interrogations and interviews that they did with him in Anchorage, Alaska. And I thought about not including them in any of my podcasts, but they were just so haunting to me that I just really felt like including them was important. As much as it like makes me like want to fucking punch babies by like listening to his fucking stupid ass laugh. Yeah, I felt it was important to include a few clips of him talking. So, like, you heard him say to the FBI himself that the serial killer he would most compare himself to is fucking Ted Bundy, who we all know was a necrophiliac. Anyway, once the family vacation was over, Israel returned to Anchorage, Alaska on February 17th of 2012. He quickly began preparing a ransom note that demanded money be placed into the account connected with Samantha's ATM card. Then he went into the shed. He retrieved Samantha's frozen body from the cupboard where he had left it. She hadn't been decomposing because her body had been left in such a cold temperature. Israel began taking steps to make it appear that she was still alive, though. He used a hairdryer to thaw her out. He applied makeup to her face, and he braided her hair. The creepiest shit of all is that he used fishing line to actually sew Samantha's eyelids open before taking a Polaroid picture of her tied up. This photo also showed Israel's arm holding the Anchorage Daily News, which was dated February 13th of 2012. He photocopied the photo, though, so that the police would not be able to get any unintentional clues from the photo. He wanted it to look a little bit blurry. After that, he typed a ransom demand on a manual typewriter he had purchased. He was demanding a ransom in the amount of $30,000. After preparing the note and photo, he placed it in Connors Bog Park on a bulletin board underneath a memorial flyer of a dog named Albert. Israel texted Dwayne, Samantha's boyfriend, using Samantha's cell phone and told him that there was a ransom note under Albert in Connors Bog Park, and it also said, "Ain't she purty?" Ugh. The note was recovered by Alaska Police Department, or Anchorage Police Department, I'm sorry. Samantha's dad studied the picture to make sure it really was Samantha, and he agreed that yes, it was Samantha, but that it was weird because her hair appeared to be in a braid, and he said that Samantha never ever wore her hair in braids. But the FBI just said, hey, maybe the kidnapper braided her hair, or maybe there's some other reason that her hair is in braids, so they didn't really make a lot out of that. In the next 3 days that followed, Israel dismembered Samantha's body and drove out to Matanuska Lake under the pretense of fishing. Israel cut a hole in the ice, and every single day for 3 days, he dropped different pieces of Samantha's remains into that lake. Then he would go home, and he would serve the fish he had caught that day to his family for dinner. Meanwhile, after speaking with the FBI and taking their advice, Samantha's father, James Koenig, deposited just $5,000 of the reward money into the account connected with Samantha's ATM card. This money had been generously donated by members of the community. The plan was to attempt to catch the perpetrator by tracking any withdrawals. So let's talk about Samantha's father, James, for a moment, shall we? When Samantha went missing and they had seen the surveillance video from Common Grounds, James immediately pioneered a huge search for Samantha. People were donating thousands of dollars for a reward. Volunteers scoured the area, posting flyers, ribbons, and pictures. Initially, the Anchorage Police Department fully believed that he was the one guilty for his daughter's disappearance, and that the boyfriend Dwayne was suspect number 2. They couldn't figure out why neither one of them had reported Samantha as being missing when she never came home from work the night of February 1st. Now, I don't feel like it's necessary to go through a lengthy, detailed story about why they did not, or why the two of them were acting completely fucking sketchy when the police department stopped by to ask them questions. Samantha's family has been through more than enough pain and heartache. Let's just suffice it to say that they had a little growing operation in their home at that time and didn't feel all comfortable when the police showed up at their door. Maybe if we didn't already know that Israel Keys is the person guilty of Samantha's abduction and murder, it would make more sense to talk about it. But we know who the murderer is. I want no part in gossiping about her father or anyone else in their family after all they've already been going through. And I'm sure they're still going through it. So I don't want to include any of that bullshit in my podcast episode. Anyway, after James made the initial deposit, the FBI was waiting to hear from the kidnapper. Obviously, they would be upset that the entire amount was not deposited, and they would reach back out with more communication. Instead of that happening, though, ATM withdrawals were being made in Anchorage, $500 at a time. Actually, the first time that someone had initiated, well, the someone being Israel, when Israel first initiated an ATM withdrawal, he had requested $600, but the daily limit was $500. So the first time that there was any action, it was denied. But then he figured it out, and he would take $500 at a time. As the days went by, there were 3 more withdrawals from ATMs in Anchorage. Israel is wearing a mask and disguise at each ATM, and even though they got immediate notification of the withdrawals, the police were always just a little bit too late getting there. Not long after, another withdrawal was made in Arizona, then New Mexico, and finally Texas. Authorities were able to determine by the camera angle of the ATM video that the masked perpetrator making these ATM withdrawals was driving a white Ford Focus. The FBI and the Texas Rangers tracked the ATM withdrawals as they occurred. Finally, on March 13th of 2012, Texas Highway Patrol Corporal Brian Henry remembered seeing an APB on a white Ford Focus, and he noticed one while he was on duty. He kept an eye on it and was waiting for the driver to make even the simplest little traffic infraction. When he did, he pulled the car over. Guys, Israel Keys was literally going 2 miles over the speed limit, and that is what got him busted. I love it. When Officer Henry asked Israel for his license, you can just imagine the fucking adrenaline he felt when he saw Israel hand him an Alaskan driver's license. The car was searched, and of course they found Samantha's cell phone and her debit card. And just like that, Israel is arrested and soon extradited back to Alaska. And with that, you guys, I'm going to cut it short here. At least I didn't leave you hanging too much. I think I told you a lot of the story. But on part 2, I'm going to discuss a lot of his FBI interviews. And I'm going to talk about another one of the murders that he confessed to in order to get a deal. He was just really trying to get a deal. He really wanted to try to protect his daughter, and he didn't want to prolong everything. So, he was trying to get the fast track to the death penalty and not have there be a lot of talk in the press about who he was, because he was just really trying to protect his daughter, which for that I can respect. But what about protecting anybody else's fucking daughters? You know what I mean? It's like all of his, well, not every single one of his victims were daughters, but many of the victims that he had were somebody's daughters. Somebody's motherfucking daughters. And, he's just a very weirdly interesting person to me, because for being a killer, he loved his daughter and he was still trying to protect her. So I feel really bad for her that, she's having to grow up in the shadow of having Israel Keys be her father. I don't know anything about her. I've never even tried to do any kind of search for her. I don't know if she's protected, if her name's been changed. I literally know nothing. But when he was arrested in 2013, she was 10 years old. So that means right now, let me do some math. Is she 19 right now? I don't know. Is Kimmy math right? Because it's 9 years later. Okay. No, it's 10 years later. No, it is 9 years later. Duh. Okay, so she's 19 years old right now. And, that worries me that, it has to have been so hard for her. I don't feel sorry for Israel at all, because he's a ginormous just fuckwad. But his daughter, Sarah, or whatever her real name is a actual person that didn't have anything to do with this, but probably has to live what her father did every day of her life. So I really hope that, she's had therapy and can find some peace. And I hope that she's doing okay. Yeah, I have a huge heart, and I care a lot about, how his daughter is doing, because that has to be fucking crazy. In the second part of this, I'm going to be talking about those FBI negotiations, and I'm going to be going into detail about a murder that he did confess to when he spoke to the FBI, and it's brutal and sad. And I thought about not talking about it at all, but then at the same time, I thought that, why would I talk about Samantha Koenig but not talk about the other 2 victims that we know of? I just felt like it would be disrespectful to leave them out. So I will be speaking to you about them. I'm not sure if I'm going to be giving you guys the episode earlier than next week. I'm going to try, because, oh my gosh, to be honest, when I listen to podcasts, if they make me wait an entire week for part 2, I know I've said this before, because I've done 2 and 3 part episodes before in the past. I really dislike having to wait an entire week. So here's my plan, guys. I'm probably going to make part 2 available to you on Thursday or Friday. I'm not promising, but I'm probably going to release it a little bit earlier just so that you don't have to wait, because I should have it ready. I have my notes all done, but I do need to tweak them a little bit because I was really, really focused on the first half. And I know that there's a few things that I can fix in part 2, so I don't want to just release it the next day, because I want to give you guys the very best work that I can give. So I really enjoy doing this, and I really hope you enjoy listening. And if you do enjoy listening, it would be great if you would consider hitting the follow button on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And it would be more amazing if you're listening on Spotify or Apple and you go ahead and give me a 5-star rating if you feel like I deserve it. And if you're listening on Apple, I would so appreciate a very honest review. My inbox is always open. I'm on Instagram every day. I'm posting reels. I'm like just really actively talking to other people, even other true crime podcasters that are new like me. And I'm on Instagram all the time. You can always jump into my DMs. You can email me at alwaystalkingcrimepodcast@gmail.com. You can join my Patreon if you'd like to. If you'd like to support me, I only have 2 tiers right now. The lowest one is just $2.50. If you just want to help support my cause, you get your episodes a day early. If you want to support me with giving me $5 a month, then you get some bonus content. You'll get at least 1 free episode every month. And there's already a few extra bonus episodes on the Patreon right now waiting for you. So those are just some extra things that you could do if you're really enjoying this podcast and, you're thinking you kind of want to support me a little bit more than just listening for free. But if that's all you want to do, that's cool too, because that's how I'm going to grow. And I love you all. I'm so appreciative of everything. We are almost to 1,500 downloads, and I'm so excited about that. So once we get it, I'm going to put a huge announcement on Instagram, something that I'm like totally working for. I can't wait till it's like 150,000, but like I'm brand new, so there's so many true crime podcasts out there. So thank you so much for listening to mine. Truly, I appreciate you. And until next time, keep talking crime.